The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the city. Emily Carter walked home from her job at a small diner, her worn-out sneakers tapping against the wet pavement. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around her body as the chilly evening breeze brushed against her skin. It had rained earlier in the day, and puddles of water were scattered across the street. Emily had just finished a long shift. Her feet ached, and her stomach growled, but she ignored it. She was used to hunger, used to exhaustion. Life had never been easy for her. After losing her parents at a young age, she had learned to survive on her own. She worked hard, dreaming of a better future, but dreams didn't pay rent. As she reached the main road, the traffic was heavy. Cars honked impatiently, people rushed past her, and the city buzzed with its usual noise. She stepped onto the sidewalk, waiting for the light to turn green, so she could cross. Just as she glanced at the bakery across the street, imagining the warm, fresh bread inside, she heard a loud splash. Before she could react, a wave of cold, muddy water hit her full force. The filthy water drenched her clothes, her face, her hair, every inch of her body. She gasped, freezing in shock as laughter and whispers filled the air around her. Hello, family. Welcome to Storytime Mutually. Kindly subscribe to my YouTube channel for more stories, like, and share this video to your friends and loved ones. Thank you as you do so. Sit back, relax as we dive into the story. People on the sidewalk stared at her, some covering their mouths in amusement, others looking at her with pity. Emily's cheeks burned with embarrassment. Her hands trembled as she wiped the mud from her face, her heart pounding in anger and shame. She turned her head just in time to see the car responsible, a sleek black Rolls-Royce with dark, tinted windows. The vehicle slowed down for a second, as if the driver had noticed what happened. Are they going to apologize? Emily thought, hope flickering inside her. But then, to her disbelief, the car suddenly sped away, disappearing into the traffic. Her hands clenched into fists. Unbelievable, she muttered under her breath. Whoever was inside that expensive car didn't care about her. They probably didn't even think she was worth a simple apology. She swallowed the lump in her throat, fighting back tears. She wanted to scream, to curse the driver, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. People like them lived in a different world, one where they never had to worry about struggling to survive. With a heavy sigh, she shook off as much mud as she could and started walking again. She had no choice. No matter how unfair life was, she had to keep going. Little did she know, the driver of that car was watching her from the rearview mirror, his heart filled with guilt. And he wasn't just anyone. He was Alexander Knight, one of the richest men in the city. And this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Inside the black Rolls-Royce, Alexander Knight sat in the back seat, staring into the rearview mirror. His sharp blue eyes were fixed on the girl standing in the middle of the sidewalk, drenched in muddy water. Guilt twisted inside him. "Sir, I didn't see the puddle." James, his driver, stammered, glancing at Alex through the mirror. "Should I stop?" For a brief moment, Alex considered it. He had seen the shock, the humiliation on the girl's face. She looked completely defeated, standing there with her arms wrapped around herself as people stared. But before he could speak, his phone rang. He sighed, running a hand through his dark brown hair. It was his assistant, probably calling about the board meeting he was already late for. "No," Alex finally said, shifting his gaze away from the mirror. "Keep driving." James hesitated but obeyed, merging into the busy traffic. As the car moved forward, Alex leaned back against the leather seat, trying to push the image of the girl from his mind. But he couldn't. Something about her expression stuck with him. The way her lips had parted in shock, the slight trembling of her hands as she wiped her face. She hadn't even screamed or caused a scene. Instead, she had simply stood there, hurt and disappointed, before walking away. She reminded him of someone from his past. His chest tightened. He exhaled slowly, staring out of the window as the city lights blurred past. "Sir?" James spoke cautiously. "Are you all right?" Alex didn't answer right away.
He was not all right.
His life was perfect on the outside. Money, power, success. He had everything most people could only dream of. But inside, he felt hollow, as if something was missing. And that girl had stirred something in him. Something he had buried a long time ago. Finally, he spoke. "James, find out who she is." James blinked, confused. "Sir?" "The girl," Alex said firmly. "The one we splashed. Find out who she is and where she works." James nodded, though he still looked unsure. "Yes, sir." Alex closed his eyes, but the image of the girl wouldn't leave his mind. He needed to find her, and he needed to make things right. Meanwhile, across the city, Emily shivered as she walked home, her wet clothes clinging to her body. Her shoes squelched with every step, and the cold evening breeze made her skin prickle. Her tiny apartment was still a few blocks away, but she couldn't bring herself to rush. What was the point? She was already late, and she knew exactly what was waiting for her: silence, loneliness, and the same struggle she faced every day. She sighed, hugging herself tighter. Why did things like this always happen to her? She had never expected life to be easy, but sometimes it felt like the universe was against her. She worked hard, never complained, yet bad luck followed her everywhere. As she passed a small store, she caught her reflection in the glass window. She winced. Her long brown hair was a mess, streaked with mud. Her face, usually fair and soft, was covered in dirt. Her once white blouse was ruined, and her jeans were soaked through. She looked awful. A lump formed in her throat, but she quickly swallowed it down. Crying wouldn't change anything. She straightened her back and kept walking. By the time she reached her apartment building, she was exhausted. She climbed the creaky stairs to the third floor, pulled out her key, and pushed open the door. The room was dark and cold. The heater had broken last week, and she hadn't had enough money to fix it. She tossed her bag onto the small couch and headed to the bathroom. She stripped off her filthy clothes, stepping into the shower. As warm water washed over her, she finally let out a long breath. But even as the mud disappeared, the humiliation stayed. And the face of the man in the car flashed in her mind. His eyes. Even though she had only seen them for a second before he sped away, she remembered them clearly: deep, piercing blue, filled with something she couldn't quite place. Guilt? No. That was impossible. Men like him didn't care about girls like her, right? She pushed the thought aside and finished her shower. Wrapping herself in a towel, she walked to her tiny kitchen and made a cup of tea. As she sat at the small table, staring at the chipped surface, she silently wished she would never see that man again. Because the next time she did, she wouldn't be able to stop herself from telling him exactly what she thought of him. The next morning, Emily arrived at work early. She tied her apron around her waist, forcing a smile as she greeted her boss. The diner was small but busy, filled with regular customers who barely noticed her. That was fine. She preferred to stay invisible. But today, someone noticed her. As she walked to a table to take an order, she felt a presence, someone watching her. A strange, intense feeling crept up her spine. She turned around slowly. And there he was. Sitting in the corner of the diner, dressed in an expensive black suit, was Alexander Knight. Her stomach dropped. What was he doing here? Their eyes met. And for the first time in years, Emily saw something in a rich man's eyes that terrified her. Regret. And something even worse. Interest. Emily's grip tightened on the notepad in her hands. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at him, the man who had splashed her with mud and then driven away like she was nothing. Now he was sitting in her diner. For a moment, she thought she was imagining things. Maybe it was just someone who looked like him. But no, it was definitely him. The expensive black suit, the sharp jawline, the piercing blue eyes. She could never forget those eyes. Alexander Knight. What was he doing here? She took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She had a job to do. Whatever game he was playing, she wasn't interested. Straightening her back, she walked toward his table. If he thought she was going to be intimidated by him, he was wrong. She stopped in front of him, pulling out her pen. Are you here to ruin my day again, or do you actually want to order something? A flicker of amusement passed through Alex's eyes, but he quickly masked it. He sat up straighter, his expression serious. I owe you an apology. Emily raised an eyebrow. For what? She asked, pretending not to know. Alex exhaled. For yesterday. My driver didn't see the puddle, but that's not an excuse. I should have stopped. I should have made sure you were okay. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. But you didn't. No, he admitted, his voice low. I didn't. She expected him to look away, to brush it off like most rich men would. But he didn't. Instead, he held her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something surprising in his expression. Sincerity. Still, she wasn't about to let him off that easily. Do you always track down every random person you splash with mud? She asked, crossing her arms. No, he said simply. Only you. That answer caught her off guard. Her breath hitched, and she quickly looked away. She would not let this man get under her skin. Look, if you came here just to make yourself feel better, then congratulations, you apologized, she said, forcing a polite smile. Now, are you actually going to order, or are you just taking up a table? A small smile tugged at the corner of Alex's lips. He liked her attitude. She wasn't intimidated by him. If anything, she seemed annoyed by his presence, and for some reason, that made him want to know more about her. I'll have a coffee, he said. Emily nodded and turned to leave. Wait, Alex said. She sighed, already annoyed. What now? He hesitated for a moment, then said, Let me buy you a new outfit. Emily froze. Slowly, she turned back to him, her expression unreadable. Excuse me? I ruined your clothes, he said. Let me fix it. Emily stared at him in disbelief. Do I look like a charity case to you? Alex frowned. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? She challenged. Because to me, it sounds like you think throwing money at people solves everything. His jaw tightened. That's not who I am. Emily let out a dry laugh. Really? Because that's exactly what a rich guy who never had to struggle a day in his life would say. Alex didn't respond immediately. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he reached into his pocket, not for money, but for a business card. He placed it on the table and slid it toward her. If you ever change your mind, he said. Emily stared at the card without touching it. I won't. Alex held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. All right. He didn't argue. He didn't push. He simply picked up his coffee and took a sip. Emily hated how calm he was. It was like nothing she said bothered him, and that frustrated her more than anything. Without another word, she turned and walked back toward the counter. But even as she focused on her work, she couldn't shake the feeling that Alexander Knight wasn't done with her yet. And worse, a small part of her wondered why that thought didn't bother her as much as it should. Emily spent the rest of her shift pretending that Alexander Knight wasn't sitting in the corner of the diner, sipping his coffee like he belonged there. But no matter how hard she tried, she could feel his presence. Every time she passed his table, she could sense his eyes on her, calm, observant, unreadable. It annoyed her. Who did he think he was? Just because he was rich didn't mean he could walk into her life and act like he cared. He had already done his part, he apologized. That should have been the end of it. So why was he still here? By the time her shift ended, she was exhausted. She untied her apron, grabbed her bag, and headed for the door. She was halfway down the street when she heard footsteps behind her. Emily. She froze. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Taking a deep breath, she turned slowly, her expression blank. Are you following me now? Alex, standing a few feet away, slipped his hands into his pockets. No, he said. I was leaving at the same time. Emily narrowed her eyes. Coincidence? She wasn't sure she believed that. All right, she said. Well, I'll be on my way now. She turned to leave, but Alex spoke again. Let me walk you home. Emily stopped mid-step. A dry laugh escaped her lips. Wow. You really don't give up, do you? Alex didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her for a moment before saying, It's late. You shouldn't be walking alone. She raised an eyebrow. I've been walking alone for years. I think I'll survive. I'm sure you will, he said. But that doesn't mean I can't walk with you. Emily folded her arms. And why do you care? A flicker of something passed through Alex's eyes, but he quickly masked it. Because I do. Emily stared at him, searching for a sign that he was lying, but all she saw was honesty. And that scared her. She didn't want his pity. She didn't want his guilt. And she definitely didn't want him caring about her. Because the last time someone had cared, they had left. She couldn't afford to let that happen again. Thanks, but no thanks, she said, turning away. I don't need a billionaire bodyguard. Without waiting for a response, she walked off, determined to ignore the strange feeling in her chest. But she didn't see the small smile that tugged at the corner of Alex's lips as he watched her go. She was different. And for the first time in a long time, Alexander Knight felt curious. The next day, Emily thought she had seen the last of Alex, but she was wrong. After her shift, she went to the public library, her favorite place to escape. She didn't have money for college, but she had books. She spent hours here, reading about things she would never experience: love, adventure, success. She was sitting at a corner table, flipping through a worn-out novel, when she heard a familiar voice. This seat taken? Her head snapped up. Alex stood there, holding a book in his hand. Emily blinked. You've got to be kidding me. He smirked. Nice to see you too. She narrowed her eyes. Are you following me again? Alex sat down without waiting for an answer.
No.
But maybe fate is. Emily rolled her eyes. Fate has nothing to do with this. Maybe, Alex said, setting his book down. Or maybe I just wanted to see what kind of books you like. Emily scoffed. And why would you care? Alex hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. Because you interest me, Emily. Her breath caught.
No.
No, no, no. This wasn't happening. He was rich. She was poor. They had nothing in common. So, why did his words make her heart race? Emily swallowed hard and looked away. Well, I'm not interested in you. Alex chuckled. You keep saying that. Because it's true. Then why are you blushing? Emily's eyes widened. I am not blushing. Alex smirked. If you say so. Emily scowled. She had no idea what this man wanted from her, but she wasn't going to fall for his charm. She wasn't some fairy tale girl who needed a rich prince to save her. She would save herself. But as she watched Alex flip open his book, completely relaxed, a tiny part of her wondered. Why did he really care? And why, despite everything, did she feel like this wasn't the last time she would see him? Emily tried her best to ignore Alexander Knight. She focused on her book, turning the pages even though she wasn't reading a single word. Across the table, Alex sat calmly, flipping through his own book as if he belonged there. As if they were just two normal people in a library and not a billionaire and a struggling waitress. She didn't trust him. Men like him didn't just show up in people's lives for no reason. He had already apologized. Why was he still here? Finally, after a few minutes of silence, she set her book down and sighed. All right. What do you want, Alex? He looked up from his book, his blue eyes calm. Why do you think I want something? Emily folded her arms. Because guys like you don't waste their time sitting in old libraries with girls like me. Alex was quiet for a moment. Then he closed his book and leaned forward slightly. And what kind of guy do you think I am? Emily raised an eyebrow.
Rich.
Arrogant. Bored. Alex chuckled. 2 out of 3. Emily blinked. Wait, which 2?
He smirked.
Wouldn't you like to know? Emily rolled her eyes. Forget it. She grabbed her book and stood up. I don't have time for this. But before she could leave, Alex spoke again.
His voice was softer this time.
More serious. You remind me of someone. Emily paused. Slowly, she turned back. Something in his tone had changed. She studied his face. His usual confidence was still there, but behind it, she saw something else. Something sad. Who? She asked before she could stop herself. Alex was quiet for a moment. Then he exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. Her name was Claire. Emily sat back down, curiosity getting the best of her. Who was she? Alex hesitated. He looked down at his hands for a second before answering. She was my best friend. We grew up together. She wasn't rich like me. She struggled a lot, just like you. Emily swallowed, unsure why his words made her chest feel tight. What happened to her? She asked softly. Alex's jaw tightened. I wanted to help her. I told her I'd fix everything, that I'd get her out of the mess she was in. He paused. But I was too late. Emily's breath caught. She knew that kind of pain. She didn't know the full story, but she could see it in his eyes. Guilt. Regret. Loss. For the first time since meeting him, she saw a man, not just a billionaire. And that scared her, because she knew what it was like to lose someone, to want to save them, but not be able to. She looked down at the table, suddenly unsure of what to say. After a long silence, Alex finally spoke. That's why I couldn't just walk away after what happened. He looked at her. When I saw you standing there, covered in mud, looking so tired, it reminded me of her. Emily felt her throat tighten. She hated this. Hated that she understood him. Hated that he had a reason for wanting to help. Because if he was just another rich guy playing games, it would be easy to ignore him. But now it wasn't so easy. Emily took a deep breath and met his gaze. I'm not her. Alex's lips pressed into a thin line. I know. Then stop trying to fix me. He studied her for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. All right. Emily blinked. Wait, that's it. A small smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. That's it. She narrowed her eyes. I don't believe you. Alex chuckled. I guess you'll just have to wait and see. Emily huffed, standing up again. You're annoying. And you're interesting, Alex replied smoothly. She rolled her eyes and walked away, but for the first time, she wasn't angry that he was here. And that realization scared her more than anything, because the last time she let someone in, they left. She wouldn't let that happen again. She couldn't. Emily tried to push Alexander Knight out of her mind. After leaving the library, she told herself it didn't matter. His past didn't matter. His guilt didn't matter. He didn't matter. But late at night, as she lay in her tiny apartment staring at the cracked ceiling, she found herself thinking about him. The way his voice had softened when he talked about Claire. The regret in his eyes. She hated that she understood it. She hated that she cared. But most of all, she hated that part of her wanted to see him again. The next evening, Emily was wiping down tables at the diner when the door chimed. She didn't bother looking up, she was too tired. But then, a familiar voice made her freeze. I'll take a coffee. Her stomach dropped. Slowly, she turned around, already knowing who it was. Alex sat at the same table as before, looking completely relaxed. He was dressed more casually this time, dark jeans and a fitted sweater, but he still looked expensive. Emily exhaled sharply. You again? Alex smirked. Missed me? No, she crossed her arms. Are you going to keep showing up like this? He tilted his head. Would you like me to stop? Yes. That's what she should say. But the words got stuck in her throat. Alex seemed to notice, because his smirk faded. He leaned forward slightly. I have an offer for you. Emily raised an eyebrow. I told you, I'm not a charity case. It's not charity, Alex said. It's a chance. Emily folded her arms. A chance for what? To go to college, Alex said simply. Emily stilled. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. What? I want to pay for your tuition, he said. Whatever school you want. Full scholarship. No strings attached. Emily stared at him. Her heart pounded in her chest. This had to be a joke. No one had ever offered her something like this. Her whole life, she had struggled. She had worked dead-end jobs just to afford food and rent. She had accepted that she would never have the future she dreamed of. And now this man, this billionaire, was offering to change everything? She shook her head. I don't believe you. Alex sighed. Emily. No, she took a step back, her hand shaking. You don't even know me. Why would you do this? Alex was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because someone once gave me a chance when I didn't deserve it. Emily swallowed hard. This was too much. Too good to be true. Her whole life, she had learned that nothing came for free, that help always came with a price. And she wasn't going to owe anyone. Not even Alex. I can't, she whispered. Alex's jaw tightened.
Why?
She met his gaze, her eyes burning. Because I don't trust you. For the first time, something flickered in Alex's expression, something raw. And for a split second, she thought he looked hurt. But then, just as quickly, he masked it. He nodded once, his face unreadable. All right. Emily expected him to argue, to try and convince her. But he didn't. He just stood up, pulled out a card, and placed it on the table. If you change your mind, he said quietly, call me. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the diner. Emily stood there, her hands clenched into fists, her chest aching. Because for the first time in her life, someone had given her a real chance. And she was too afraid to take it. Emily stared at the business card on the table. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, her fingers barely brushing the edge before she snatched them back.
No.
She couldn't accept his help. Because if she did, it would mean trusting him. And trusting people had only ever led to disappointment. With a deep breath, she grabbed the card and shoved it into her pocket, not because she planned to use it, but because she couldn't stand looking at it anymore. Then, she went back to work, forcing herself to act like nothing had happened. But everything had changed. For the rest of the night, Alex's words haunted her. I want to pay for your tuition. A full scholarship. No strings attached. It sounded like a fairy tale, but Emily had never been the kind of girl who believed in fairy tales. She had learned the hard way that people didn't just do things out of the kindness of their hearts. Even if Alex meant well, even if he truly wanted to help, what if she let herself believe in this? And then it all fell apart. She couldn't afford to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope was painful. And yet, as she walked home that night, she found herself hesitating outside a payphone. Her fingers curled around the card in her pocket. She could call.
Just to see.
Just to know if this was real. Her heart pounded as she lifted the receiver. But then, before she could dial, a voice echoed in her head. People like us don't get lucky, Emily. We survive. That's all. She squeezed her eyes shut. Her mother's voice. The words she had heard so many times growing up. Slowly, she put the receiver back down and walked away. The next day, Emily tried to push it all aside, but the world had other plans. As she stepped into the diner for her shift, she noticed the way her coworkers were whispering, staring at her. Her stomach twisted. What? She asked, glancing around. Why is everyone looking at me? Her friend, Maggie, bit her lip. You don't know? Emily frowned. Know what? Maggie hesitated, then grabbed her phone and held it up. Emily's heart stopped. Right there on the screen was a news article, and at the top was her face. Her stomach dropped as she read the headline. Billionaire Alexander Knight's mysterious interest in local waitress. Who is she? Emily's breath came in short, sharp gasps. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. She grabbed the phone, scrolling down. Dozens of photos. Some from the diner. Some from the library. Even one from the street where Alex had offered to walk her home. Paparazzi. They had been watching, recording everything. And now the whole world thought she was some mystery girl linked to a billionaire. Some kind of scandal. Emily felt sick. This is insane, she whispered. I barely know him. Maggie gave her a sympathetic look. I know, but the internet doesn't care. Emily's hands shook as she set the phone down. She felt exposed, like her whole life had just been ripped open for strangers to pick apart. And there was only one person to blame. Alexander Knight. Later that night, Emily stormed into the grand lobby of Knight Enterprises. The security guards barely had time to react before she marched past them, her anger burning hotter than any fear. She didn't know what she was doing. She didn't care. All she knew was that Alex had ruined her life. She reached the elevator and slammed the button. When the doors opened, she stepped inside, ignoring the guards' protests. By the time she reached the top floor, her heart was pounding. She burst through the office doors. And there he was, standing behind his massive desk, looking calm, controlled, perfect as always. But when he saw her, something flickered in his expression. Emily marched forward, slamming the business card down on his desk. "You did this." Alex frowned. "What?" "The article." Her voice shook with anger. "The photos." "My life is a joke now. Thanks to you." Alex's eyes darkened. He rounded the desk in 2 long strides, standing close, too close. "I didn't leak that story, Emily." His voice was low. "Dangerous. And I sure as hell didn't want this for you." Emily glared at him, but doubt crept in. He looked furious. Not at her. At whoever had done this. "You expect me to believe that?" she challenged. Alex exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't expect anything from you, Emily." His jaw clenched. "But I promise you, I would never do this." Emily wanted to keep hating him, wanted to believe he was just another rich man playing games. But the way he looked at her, the fire in his eyes, made it hard to breathe. For the first time since this all started, she felt something worse than anger. She felt afraid, because deep down, she believed him, and that meant someone else had done this. And if the media had already decided she was part of Alex's world, then there was no escaping it now. Her life would never be the same. Emily's breath was unsteady as she stared at Alexander. She wanted to keep blaming him, to believe that this was just another example of the rich ruining the lives of people like her. But as she stood there, watching his jaw clench, his hands ball into fists, she saw something she hadn't expected.
Rage.
Not at her. At whoever had done this to her. And that made her feel something she wasn't ready for.
Trust.
She swallowed hard. "If it wasn't you, then who?" Alex exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I have a few guesses." He turned and grabbed his phone, pressing a number.
Damien. Find out who leaked that story. Now.
Emily stood frozen as Alex barked orders into the phone. He spoke with power, like a man who was used to being obeyed. She had spent so long believing that the rich never cared about people like her. But Alex wasn't just any rich man. And that scared her more than anything. When he ended the call, his eyes softened. "Emily, I promise you I'll fix this." Her throat tightened. "And then what?" Alex frowned. "What do you mean?" Emily looked down, her hands trembling. "This, whatever this is. You showing up in my life, making these insane offers, trying to help me. What happens when you're done feeling guilty?" Alex's expression darkened. "You think this is about guilt?" Emily let out a bitter laugh. "Isn't it?" He took a step closer. "No," his voice was firm. "This isn't about Claire. This isn't about pity. This is about you." Emily's breath hitched. "I admire you," he said, his voice lower now.
Softer.
"Your strength. Your independence. The way you keep fighting even when the world tries to break you." His gaze locked onto hers. "I don't want to fix you, Emily. I just want to stand beside you." Something inside her cracked. For years, she had been alone. Fighting, surviving, never daring to hope. But now this man, this powerful, untouchable billionaire, was standing in front of her, choosing her. Not out of guilt, not out of pity, but because he saw her. And for the first time in her life, she let herself believe it. Tears burned her eyes. "I don't know how to let people in," she whispered. Alex's lips curled into a small, sad smile. "Then let me teach you." Emily sucked in a shaky breath. Then, finally, she let go. She stepped forward, and before she could change her mind, she pressed her lips to his. Alex froze for a second. Then his hands slid around her waist, pulling her close. The kiss was slow, hesitant, like two people afraid of breaking something fragile. But as she melted into him, she realized something. She wasn't breaking. She was falling. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid. 2 days later, Emily and Alex sat in his penthouse, waiting for Damien, his head of security, to arrive with answers. Emily was nervous. Whoever had leaked the story had invaded her privacy, exposed her to the world, and turned her life upside down. She needed to know who had done it. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Alex stood and opened it. Damien walked in, his expression serious. "I found out who leaked the story," he said. Emily's hands clenched. "Who?" Damien sighed. "It was someone from the diner. A waitress named Lisa Carter." Emily's eyes widened. "Lisa?
No.
That's not possible." Lisa had worked at the diner for months. She was friendly, always making jokes, always gossiping, but Emily had never thought she was cruel. "She took pictures of you and Alex together," Damien continued. "Then she sold them to a tabloid for a quick payday." Emily felt like she had been punched. She had trusted Lisa. Maybe not as a close friend, but enough to believe she wouldn't betray her like this. Alex watched her carefully.
"I can handle this," he said.
"I can make sure she—" "No," Emily interrupted. "I'll handle it." Alex hesitated, then nodded. "All right." The next day, Emily walked into the diner, her heart pounding. Lisa was behind the counter, laughing with another waitress. But when she saw Emily, her smile vanished. "Emily," Lisa said, forcing a nervous laugh. Hey." Emily didn't waste time. "You sold my pictures to the media." The entire diner fell silent. Lisa swallowed hard. "Emily, Why?" Emily's voice trembled. "Was it just for money? Or did you enjoy ruining my life?" Lisa looked away. "I didn't think it would be a big deal," she mumbled. I needed the money. And you were suddenly close to a billionaire. I thought maybe you'd be fine." Emily's stomach twisted. Lisa hadn't cared about what would happen to her. All she had seen was a chance to profit from Emily's misery. Emily took a deep breath. "You don't get to decide what I'm fine with." Her voice was steady now. "I trusted you, Lisa." Lisa looked guilty, but it didn't change anything. Emily turned and walked out of the diner for the last time. She wasn't coming back. That evening, Emily stood on Alex's balcony, looking out at the city lights. She felt free. For the first time in years, she wasn't trapped in the cycle of struggling just to survive. She had options. Alex stepped beside her, slipping his hand into hers. "What's next?" he asked softly. Emily smiled. "I'm going to college." Alex's lips curled into a smirk. "Took you long enough." She nudged him playfully. "Shut up." His arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer. "I'm proud of you." Emily's heart swelled. She had spent so long believing that love was just another fairy tale meant for other people.
But now?
Now she knew. Sometimes life does give second chances. And sometimes getting splashed by mud is just the beginning of something beautiful. That brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.